There's no easy dance whenever you go to wrestle with Lee Kemp.
Lee is a legend. I believe he is a hero. I just feel like his story's never been told.
He'd wrestle one match and he'd win. He'd wrestle another match and he'd win, and he'd win, and he'd win.
He was going to be the favorite to win the Olympic Games. His chances of winning were extremely high.
I have notified the Olympic Committee that with Soviet invading forces in Afghanistan, neither the American people nor I will support sending an Olympic team to Moscow.
In the sport of wrestling, the Olympic gold medal is the pinnacle.
You could be a world champion for the next 20 years, but if you don't win the Olympics, people won't know about you.
Lee was a world champion and maybe the best dude on the planet. And then just to have somebody say, hey, this whole thing you've been training all this time for is not going to happen anymore, and have it just yanked away, what do you do next?
He disappeared. Everyone just lost track of him.
When he went to jail, that was the lowest point of his life.
When I think of Lee Kemp, I think that you have a second chance. Always a second chance.
Feel somebody like that should be praised. I mean, Lee is one of the greatest American wrestlers of all time.
Well, welcome. I'm very excited to be here, and I'd like to thank the organizers for having me come to be here. And that was a trailer to a documentary of a story about my life, which is pretty amazing. I was able to have that done. The thing about that trailer, it showed a major disappointment that happened in my life. I was an athlete, and I was favored to win the Olympic Games. I mean, you've all heard of the Olympic Games, right? That's a pretty big deal. I had trained my whole life for that one moment, and our country didn't go. It was in 1980. There were some political things going on, and our president at the time would not allow our athletes to go to the Olympic Games. And just imagine that, something you've worked for your entire life, and now it's just sort of taken away. The second thing that happened in my life is that I went through some personal struggles in my personal life. Personal struggles are not, anyone can have them, and I went through them. So part of what I always want to talk about to people, especially young people, is about resilience. Resilience in life is something that is vitally important for anything positive to happen in your life. Because as I just mentioned, your life can go through some hardships. You can have some things that you just can't, frankly, you just can't believe that's happening to you, but they do. The one thing I've learned about life is that life goes on, right? So when life goes on, you have to decide what you're going to do with your life. So the resilience is something that everyone has to have. Main thing I like to talk about when you do have something bad that happens to you is the word acceptance. I feel like accepting something bad is probably one of the hardest things that people can do. And I went for probably more than 10 years not accepting the tragedies, and I'll call them tragedies, missing the Olympics, having the unfortunate, personal situations that I went through. And I just couldn't imagine that they happened to me. I was in denial, and I just couldn't see that something like that happened to me. So for the longest time, I just couldn't face those unfortunate circumstances. This is the way I like to explain acceptance. If I gave you a gift and you didn't take it, you didn't accept it, then whose gift is it then? If you think about that for a little bit, that's the situation I was in. Because we really don't know what the circumstance is going to bring to us, but if we reject it, we're never going to know. And some people that I've talked to that went through some horrible circumstances, they'll tell you that horrible circumstance was the best thing that ever happened to them. And I can even attest to that in my own life. Going through those hardships was probably one of the best things that ever happened to me, because it forced me to be resilient. It forced me to learn how to come back. But finally, when I accepted what happened to me, I could just move on and let it go. When you notice and you can see yourself not complaining and not shifting blame, that's when you start to accept. So it's hard to put yourself in a place to accept hardships, but I'm telling you that is the first key to moving yourself into a direction that's going to give you some freedom to then start making better choices. But the moment you start to accept things that you have no control over, because we can decide what we have control over, and the things that we can control, if we can put our focus on those things, and then we can move our life ahead. In my life, I was focusing too much on the things that I couldn't get, the things that didn't go right, instead of focusing on the things that could go right. The moment I started to focus on what I had left to accomplish, that's when my life started to flourish a little bit again.
When wrestling had been boycotted and the USA couldn't go to the Olympics, how did you cope, I guess, or deal with that as you had been working for that?
Wow, that's a great question. What's your name?
I'm Grayson.
Grayson, that's an amazing question. I'm not totally proud of it, but I'm human. We're all human. I'll say to you that I've never gotten over it, and that doesn't mean that you can't be productive and be happy and move on. And that's how important wrestling was to me. It was like, I compare it to like a death of someone close to me. And when you think about it, it was the death of a dream that I had that was taken away from me, and I can't ever get it back. Life keeps going on. That's the thing that I've learned. Life always goes on. When I didn't make the Olympic team, I kind of dropped out of wrestling altogether. I was just so frustrated with it. And when I finally started to bring wrestling back in my life as a coach, I started to fill it with mentoring young people, coaching young people, and that culminated to me being chosen as the Olympic coach in the 2008 Beijing Olympics. So in 1980, I missed my opportunity to be on the Olympic team. I got my opportunity to walk in the opening ceremonies as a coach 38 years later.
How was your first win and how did you feel?
The question was, how was my first win in wrestling? And that's a great question, because in the 2 years prior, I tried to play basketball and I didn't make the team, right? So I sat on that bench for 2 solid seasons. I got in the game for about 5 seconds, maybe, my 8th grade year. And the moment I got my hands on the ball, I shot it. So when I got into wrestling, something that I could actually control myself, it wasn't a coach putting me in the game and pulling me out. When it was just me and this other person that I was competing against, and I won my very first match, that meant so much to me. So I'm glad you brought that up. That gave me the incentive to keep going at it, to keep trying and keep trying to get better at it. And I think in life we have to look for successes. And I think we should be able to try different things. How many of you play different sports here in the room? Like more than one sport, I guess I should say. I think that's important, because had I not tried different sports, I never would have found wrestling.
What inspired you, especially when you were at your lowest, to keep going?
Wow, that's a great question. The question was, what inspired me to keep going when I was at my lowest? Everybody goes through stuff, and this is going to sound maybe simplistic, but I hope it doesn't. I can remember staying in bed all day, just like laying in bed, seeing the sun come up, because you can see it through your window, the shades, and then you're just laying there, whatever, and then you see it going down again. I'm thinking, oh my God, I've been in bed all day. That's when it was like a wake-up call. I said, okay, you have to get out of bed and go outside. I got up, I got outside, I started thinking about the things that I wanted to do with my life. And when you start putting thoughts like that out into the world, into the universe, what starts coming back to you are solutions. And one of the solutions that came back to me was someone offered me the opportunity to coach, because I still had all my credentials in wrestling, but I just didn't make the Olympic team. But this coach invited me to come do a clinic with a group of wrestlers. And I said no at first, but then a good friend of mine encouraged me to go. And I went and I saw the joy that I got out of being in the wrestling room again, coaching other athletes. So the thing is, the key to that story is, each and every one of us in the room, you have to find something in your life that you like, that you can be passionate about.
Legends are driven by purpose, a vision of who they must be, and Lee Kemp was no different. He was driven to be one of the very best ever. Anything less than that was simply not good enough.
Well, there were a number of turning points, but there was a huge turning point for Lee when his high school coach took him and a handful of other teammates to a clinic where the legendary wrestler Dan Gable was featured. Lee didn't just listen to every word Dan spoke. He watched all his mannerisms, he watched his confidence, and he watched the way that Dan conducted himself. Dan Gable was everything Lee wanted to be someday. At one point, Gable said something that would become the premise upon which Lee would approach every single one of his matches going forward. Gable said he didn't believe anyone was going to win a match just because of their credentials. Anybody can be beaten. And because Dan Gable said it, Lee believed him.
Lee Kemp did everything with an intense drive and determination to not just win, but to dominate. And dominate he did.
Lee goes undefeated the rest of his high school career with a 54-0 record, winning 2 state titles. He then goes on from there to the University of Wisconsin. In his freshman year, he fights his way to the final round of the NCAA Wrestling Championship and loses in a split decision. It becomes a huge controversy, and to this day, many feel that Lee should have won the title.
This doesn't set well with Kemp. You can't be one of the best ever and not win championships. He vows and even commits to his coaches and teammates that he will never lose another match in his collegiate career again. Quite a bold statement. Lee's teammates are all basically telling him to accept the fact that he's going to lose. And at one point, Dwayne Clevin, the head coach of Wisconsin, asks Lee to drop from 158 pounds to 150 pounds just so he doesn't have to wrestle Gable. But Lee Kemp stands his ground. How can you be the best if you don't face the best?
This really is a great example of how the average person approaches the game of life versus how a legend approaches it. We can see, hear, smell, taste, and touch. Now, most of this information is being filtered and rejected by a thing at the top of our spinal cord called the reticular formation. This does not allow any of our senses to pass through to our conscious awareness except things that are unusual, or a threat, or things of extreme value, and things that are programmed into our needs. Now, for the average person who thinks deductively, the information that comes into our conscious awareness is immediately weighed against the belief system. If the information coming in fits with the existing structures of belief, it feels comfortable and we habitually move on it. On the other hand, if it doesn't fit in or within our belief structure, the defense system engages and we flight from it or we fight against it. In the case of Dan Gable, Lee's teammates and coaches received this information through the threat and extreme values filter. That information was then weighed against what they believed about Gable, which was he cannot be beaten. Their defense system took over, and without even thinking about it, they tried to get as far away from that threat as possible.
In the first round of the tournament, Gable beats his first opponent 13-3. He then turns around and pins one of Kemp's teammates, something Lee had never been able to do. Gable was back and was just as much of a dominating force as he was before.
Lee is standing there, watching his idol dominate this tournament. Something that would overwhelm any opponent. But Lee notices something. The guys that were going against Gable weren't trying all that hard. They just weren't wrestling.
It's all about belief and the effects belief has on performance. But the question is, what is belief? Belief is the subconscious acceptance of worth, ability, and environment. To say it's subconscious is to say it's habitual, meaning it's happening without us even thinking about it. So if you have something destructive that you've accepted about yourself, when you find yourself facing that thing in the background subconsciously, your belief system is altering your own behavior and action until the destructive thing you have accepted about yourself becomes true.
While everyone was thinking Kemp was going to lose, he was looking for a way to win. Again, the premise that he approached every match with, given to him by the guy he was about to face, is this. He didn't believe anyone was going to win a match just because of their credentials. Anyone can be beaten.
When a legend receives information through their environment, instead of weighing it against their belief system, they weigh it against their purpose, that vision of who they must be. If this information does not fit their purpose, they reject it immediately, and they do it somewhat ruthlessly because nothing is going to get in the way of their goal.
For Kemp, wrestling Gable took him in the direction of his goal. If he is going to be the best, he must compete and even beat the best. There was no way Kemp was going to do anything else but get on that mat and compete with all of his might.
The bout starts with a packed house. The place is electric as Gable comes out in his usual fashion, aggressively attacking his opponent. It looks like Kemp is just playing defense, but what he's really doing is playing his game. A minute and 20 seconds into the first period, he scores on a single leg takedown. The place goes crazy. The start of the second period, Kemp breaks Gable's hold to go up 3-1.
Somewhere in the match, Kemp says to himself, you know what? I can beat this guy. I think I'm going to go ahead and do it.
It was 4-3 going into the third period when Kemp scores another takedown. Kemp was then reversed by Gable, taking the score to 7-6.
As Lee was trying to hold on to his narrow lead, he began to think that he had fought hard, and if Gable were to take him down and win by one, then no one was going to say that he had fought a bad match. As a matter of fact, his teammates would actually compliment him on a great match. After all, this is the great Dan Gable. But suddenly, something switched inside of him, and he said, no. You don't have to lose this match. You can win.
As the clock was winding down, you could see an intense battle between what would become two legends in the world of wrestling. But in the end, Kemp holds strong and beats the unbeatable Dan Gable.
No one worked as hard as Gable, except Kemp. No one had the mental strength of Gable, except Kemp. There was no one that owned the mat as much as Gable did, except Kemp. There is a reason why these two men, who came from very humble and even dark situations, moved into legends.
As you can see in that video was to convey when you have to go up against like something that seems impossible. It's framed in a wrestling match right now, but Dan Gable was this unbeatable figure, this legend that I could have avoided competing against, but I wanted the challenge because that was my purpose. My purpose was to be the best. That's the goal that I set in my mind.
My question is, how did it feel those last 30 seconds wrestling Ishii, to dig deep and keep going?
Everyone get that? That's important. How did it feel that last 30 seconds wrestling Gable? And those are the moments that we usually give it up. Not giving up because we don't want to win, but the pressure gets so great that and that self-worth, that example of belief, you should write that down, that belief, that's one of the best definitions of belief that I've ever heard. It's just your subconscious acceptance of your ability. We all know, what our abilities are a little bit, but worth is something that's hard to measure. Ability, you can measure. If you're fast, you can clock yourself, you just know you're athletic, right? Your worth is something internal. That's your internal acceptance of who you are. I felt that I was just as deserving to win as Dan Gable was. How did I develop that? I developed that through feeling totally prepared. I felt like I had worked hard enough. I felt like I had studied my opponents enough. I felt like I had enough technique, I had enough strength, enough conditioning. I truly had that feeling like, why not me? I should be able to win. So the last 30 seconds was my mind going through a whole series of things that I just said, worth questions. I was asking myself, do I deserve to win this, if you can believe that? But in the end, it settled in my mind that somebody's got to win, why not me? So I'm going to make sure I do everything I can do to win this match myself. My goal was to be a state champion after only my first year of wrestling. Right? Does that sound reasonable? No one thought that was reasonable, but it's my goal, so why not? And That first year, I was 11 wins, eight losses, and 3 ties, right? That's kind of like what everybody expected. But I didn't give up on that dream. The next year, though, the next 2 years, I went undefeated, and I won the state tournament, beating the defending state champ and the defending place winner.
What were your thoughts when you were wrestling Dan?
The question is, what were my thoughts when I was wrestling Dan? That's a great question. I was wrestling this human being in front of me. I wasn't wrestling Dan Gable. And I would say that to athletes that I've coached. If I was mentally wrestling Dan Gable, I have no way would I have won that match, because I would have been thinking about what that video says, right? The belief system, right? The belief system, Dan Gable's unbeatable. He's older than me. He's Olympic champion. There's no way I can beat him. I mean, your mind just starts racing with why this can't happen. I just wiped my mind blank, and I was just wrestling another human being in front of me that I wanted to win. All right, you can ask it.
How many people have you wrestled in your life?
That's a great question. How many people have I wrestled? I've had probably close to 500 matches in my life. Probably more like 450 matches. Let's just make it a round number. 450 matches in my life.
From 1 to 10, how hard was it when you started to beginning wrestling?
The question is, how hard was it when I first started wrestling? It was really hard. If you try something that you've never tried before, and you know it's going to be kind of hard, but you've never done it before and you try it, is it going to be hard or easy? Hard. So I wasn't naive going into it thinking it was going to be easy. I knew it was going to be hard. In fact, it was really hard. It was really hard, and I wanted to, I wouldn't say quit, but I just, I was getting beat up in practice. I didn't know what I was doing, but you just hang in there. And a couple weeks after that, I was doing better than I was before, and that gave me courage to continue.
Sir, a round of applause for ice cream. I need to recognize who has sponsored this event. Donald Griffin, the founder of Black Wall Street.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is awesome, man. I'm really happy I had a chance.
Thank you. I want to give a big round of applause to Donald Griffin and Black Wall Street.
Thank you, man.
Yeah,
I will wear this proudly. Thank you. Very much so. This is very cool.